Hello lovelies, in this video we're going to be looking at types of conservation for your A-level biology.
Types of conservation. The first type we need to know is in situ conservation. This is where species are protected in their natural habitat. So think in situ conservation in natural habitat. We need to know some examples of in situ conservation. Protected areas on land and also marine conservation zones for within the water. These areas, obviously, once an area is protected, it can't be built on. We can't destroy or deforest the land. That's why protected areas help conserve species. Also, specific habitats can be protected. So in protected areas, both the habitat and the species are protected. In protected habitats, obviously, it's the ground, the land, the trees and everything that are protected. And that means that obviously the species benefit from that. Controlling species introduction. So a lot of places like Australia prevent species being introduced. So new species that wouldn't naturally be there from being introduced. Restoring or rewilding damaged areas that have been damaged. And legal protections for organisms to stop them being hunted or traded. What are the advantages of in situ conservation? It is less disruptive. Often both the species and the habitat are conserved, such as with protected areas. There's a greater chance that populations will recover in these in situ conservation setups. So if the habitat is protected or the habitat is restored or rewilded, then species and populations are more likely to recover. The disadvantages of in situ conservation. It is hard to control all the factors that are threatening a species when just protecting an area or a habitat. So we can't control all variables, and there could be other things such as poaching or hunting or traps or climate that are things that are out of the control of the people trying to do the conservation. So let's have a look in a little bit more detail at some in situ conservation examples. Wildlife reserves and national parks. So these create large areas that are protected with legislation to protect the wildlife, the animals in it, and their habitat. There are restrictions, but some human activity must still be allowed because we can't completely prevent things that were happening on this land and have been for a very long time that would previously have been in harmony with the animals and species there, especially for humans who were living there and were living on this land before. So some farming, some hunting or building might be allowed, but it would be highly restricted. And things like poaching or hunting of certain animals or the numbers of animals being allowed to be hunted would be massively restricted. And land that already exists for farming would be fine, but maybe not creating new land and not destroying any habitat in order to create new farmland and things like that. Community engagement is really important, and educating tourists as well. So a lot of these places, like the big safari parks in Africa, for example, obviously bring in a lot of money through ecotourism, but the idea around this is to get communities engaged in them, helping out and supporting, potentially working in these wildlife reserves and national parks, and using them as opportunities to educate people about the conservation efforts. Marine conservation zones. So these are areas where overfishing and pollution are majorly restricted, and the idea is to protect the biodiversity of rare habitats or rare species within these marine areas. It's obviously a lot harder with marine environments to kind of like put a fence around and restrict those areas because it's in the ocean, but we can really try and prevent fishing boats and sort of legalise the dumping of pollution and making sure it's not happening around these areas where specific habitats and species are going to be affected. Repopulation. Another way of putting this would be like rewilding. So it's a way of reintroducing native species into recreated wildlife habitats. So maybe letting places recover from having deforestation or recover from being impacted in some way, or we've kind of reintroduced some plant species and created this new wildlife habitat, but it is sort of in the natural area where these species would normally have lived. And if we've lost biodiversity in that area, being able to reintroduce species and increase biodiversity when it's been lost. So it could be something like rewilding, so place that was used to feed animals, livestock, where they just sort of mow down all the grass and they would eat all of the plant species. You removed the livestock, let that rewild back to like a wildflower meadow, and then you could reintroduce some insect species or traditional native species that would be there in order to kind of take back and repopulate and rewild an area to reintroduce biodiversity. The other type of conservation is ex situ conservation. So this is where organisms are removed from their natural habitat. The conservation then takes place in a new location, such as a zoo. Examples include relocating organisms to a safer area, breeding organisms in captivity, such as zoos, freezing and storing seeds in a seed bank, growing plants in botanic gardens. What are the advantages of ex situ conservation? The opposite to in situ conservation in this case is that the environment can be completely controlled, so there can be no predation or hunting or external factors that are out of the control of the people running the conservation. There's less competition for resources between individuals than there would be in the wild. Their health can be monitored, and if needs be, they can be treated by a vet. Breeding can be manipulated through either selective or artificial selection and also IVF. At the end of ex situ conservation, species can be reintroduced to various areas. The disadvantages for ex situ conservation: it can often only involve a small number of individuals. We are not looking at conserving a whole population. It can be very expensive to maintain the habitats and environments needed to look after the organisms. There's a high risk of disease transfer between humans and animals. Animals can become too used to humans, so that even though we can reintroduce species, they may not be able to go back and live in the wild as they were before, and they may get too close and too familiar with humans in the wild, and that can obviously be damaging to the population. So let's look at some ex situ conservation examples. So the first one we're going to look at is zoos. So zoos obviously breed and house endangered species, so they're a great resource for scientific research because the animals are accessible, they're normally well trained, used to humans, and doing the research on them is not going to cause them as much distress. They're also a great genetic resource, easy to get samples from and things like that, and to observe their behaviours, which is much easier than it is to do in the wild. And one of the main sort of reasons for having zoos is that they are captive breeding programs, so they are aiming to release endangered species into the wild to help boost their numbers and to prevent species from going extinct. They can be used to produce large numbers of endangered plant species through things like tissue culture, but also through obviously collecting seeds, which would normally be spread wide in the wild, but if we collect them all and then we can grow up those new plants. And in the same way as zoos, these can be really helpful for reintroducing plants into the wild if we need to, or as research, so be able to grow the plants up for research in order to try and help preserve ones that are in the wild. The problem with botanic gardens is, unlike zoos, they're actually quite hard to fund because there's less public engagement with plants than there are with animals. Seed banks. These are collections of viable seeds stored either frozen or dried for a really long time. So the seeds are tested regularly for viability to see if they can still germinate, because if they can't, then there's no point in having them. But they sort of take small samples and check them regularly and then replace them when they can. So we've got this kind of massive genetic resource stored in all of these seeds. This is really important because obviously we can use that genetic resource for research, but also we can then grow up some of these seeds in order to rewild certain populations if they've been, or areas if it's been cleared for land or something like that. Also as food crop sources or building material sources for rural communities or communities that aren't able to access wild versions of these plants, but they can still then have some seed to get started to grow various plants that they need.
Ouch! This is why in some videos I'll explain scratches.